Some mornings arrive so quietly you almost miss the moment they begin. There is that particular kind of light, the kind that comes in low through a window, slow and without announcement, the way something certain and unhurried always moves. It touches the edge of a curtain. It finds the corner of a room, and the world without any ceremony at all simply continues. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you are welcome to stay. Now, let's drift. There is something worth sitting with on a night like this. Something about light itself, about where it comes from, and what it quietly does to us every single morning before we have even opened our eyes. Because the light that woke you this morning, or the light that is not yet here waiting on the other side of tonight, travelled a very long way to find you. The sun sits on average about 93 million miles from where you are lying right now. That number is almost too large to feel. It is the kind of distance the mind accepts without truly understanding. But here is something smaller, something the body can almost hold the light from the sun. Takes approximately 8 minutes to travel from its surface to yours. 8 minutes. Researchers have found that this is not a fixed number. It varies slightly depending on where the Earth is in its annual orbit. When we are a little closer to the sun in the early months of the year, that journey takes around 8 minutes and 10 seconds. When we are at our furthest, the light takes closer to 8 minutes and 20 seconds. A difference of 10 seconds across the span of a year. There is something almost tender about that. The sun at its closest and its furthest still arrives, still finds its way, and the light that reaches your window each morning carries with it a kind of quiet history, a record of that journey compressed into warmth. The light itself is not a single thing. What we call sunlight is actually a mixture of many different wavelengths, each one carrying a different amount of energy. Scientists describe these wavelengths along a spectrum from the long, slow waves of red and orange to the shorter, quicker waves of violet and blue. When sunlight enters the atmosphere, something happens to it. The atmosphere is full of tiny molecules, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, and when light passes through them, those shorter, higher energy wavelengths scatter in all directions. Blue light, in particular, scatters widely across the whole dome of the sky. This is why on a clear day the sky appears blue, not because it is blue, but because blue light is being redirected, scattered, softened, sent everywhere at once. The brain tends to interpret this scattered blue as a kind of calm. Neuroscientists have observed that exposure to short-wavelength light in the morning, that particular blue quality of early daylight, signals to the brain that the day has begun. Not through thought, not through intention, but through something deeper and older than either of those things. A signal passed from the eye to a small cluster of neurons in the brain, which researchers call the suprachiasmatic nucleus. A name that sounds complicated, but which simply means the part of you that knows what time it is, without any clocks, without any effort, without you ever having to decide. And when the sun first appears above the horizon each morning, it is not the bright white light of midday that arrives first. It arrives red. It may seem counterintuitive, but the redness of sunrise is caused by distance, by how far the light must travel through the atmosphere when the sun sits low on the horizon. At that angle, sunlight passes through a much thicker layer of air than it does at noon. The short blue wavelengths scatter away before they reach you. What remains, what survives that long, low journey through the atmosphere is the warm end of the spectrum. Red amber, a kind of deep and settling orange. Studies indicate that humans have a measurable response to these warm colours in the early morning light, something quieter than alertness, something closer to readiness, a gentle softening of whatever the night held. It is one of the oldest experiences a body can have. Long before electric light, long before any artificial source of illumination, the body learned to read the quality of light as a kind of language. Red means something is beginning. Blue means we are fully here, and the slow transition between them that 20 or 30 minutes of changing colour as the sun lifts above the horizon, that was once the only alarm clock any living creature had. There is a word researchers use for this internal clock, circadian. It comes from the Latin meaning approximately 1 day, and it describes a rhythm that runs through nearly every living organism on Earth, from the largest animals to the smallest single-celled organisms, from the bark of trees to the behaviour of coral in the deep ocean. The circadian rhythm is not simply a response to light, it is something more internal than that, a biological oscillation, a pulse that the body would maintain even in total darkness. Experiments have shown that humans placed in environments with no natural light cues whatsoever will continue to follow a cycle close to 24 hours. The rhythm does not disappear when the light disappears, but it drifts. Without the daily signal of sunlight, the internal clock slowly loses its calibration. It may extend to 25 hours or drift toward 24 and a half. The body keeps time, but without the sun to reset it, that timekeeping becomes slightly gently imprecise. It seems that we need the light not to create the rhythm, but to keep it honest. This is the ordinary miracle of a morning, not the sound of an alarm, not the habit of coffee, not the routine of a day beginning, but this a star 93 million miles away, sending out light that will take 8 minutes to arrive, and which when it does will pass through layers of atmosphere, scatter into blue, warm the edges of the horizon into amber, and gently, without asking anything of you, reset the clock that your cells have been keeping since before you were born. Every morning, without exception. There is a quality to that reliability that the mind finds difficult to fully register because we are so accustomed to it. It is the kind of thing that only becomes visible in its absence. Psychologists often note that humans struggle to imagine the removal of things they have never experienced losing. We cannot truly picture a world without gravity from the inside of it. We cannot feel what silence means if we have never heard it contrasted with sound, and we cannot easily imagine a morning without light until perhaps we are asked to. Because there have been mornings, real mornings in real places witnessed by real people who wrote down what they saw when the light did not arrive as expected. Not gradually, not with the slow dimming of an overcast sky or the grey softness of a cloudy dawn, but suddenly, in the middle of the day, as if someone somewhere had simply decided that the light was done, the sky would shift. The colours would change in ways that belong to no known time of day. Orange at the horizon, deep, violet overhead, the stars beginning to appear against a darkening blue at noon. And in that strange, unexpected dimming, something would happen, not just to the sky, but to everything beneath it. The birds, the insects, the temperature of the air, and the people watching who would reach for whatever words they had. Researchers have collected hundreds of historical accounts of these moments, written in languages as different as Akkadian cuneiform and 16th century Spanish from places as distant as ancient China and the plains of colonial North America. All of them describing the same quiet astonishment. All of them searching for a way to say the day became something it had never been before. And the science of what happens in those moments, what the atmosphere does, what the body does, what the smallest creatures around us do, is something quieter and stranger than most people realize. It may be that the most revealing thing about sunlight is not what it looks like when it is here, but what the world becomes in the moments before it returns. There is a particular kind of seinen that belongs to things we cannot yet know, not the silence of absence, not the silence of an empty room or a held breath, but the silence of a gap, a space between what has happened and what we've been told about it. Between the event and the news of the event. Between reality and our awareness of reality. The universe, it turns out, is full of this kind of silence. Consider the light that reached you this morning, the warmth that came through the curtains, the brightness that shifted the room from dark to dim to gold. That light did not begin its journey when you woke. It began its journey 8 minutes earlier, while you were still asleep, while the world outside was still deciding what kind of morning to become. At the speed of light, roughly 186,000 miles per second, the distance between the Sun and the Earth takes approximately 8 minutes and 20 seconds to cross. This is not a metaphor. This is not an approximation chosen for its neatness. It is simply how far away the Sun is and how fast light travels, and what those two facts produce when placed alongside each other. 8 minutes and 20 seconds. What this means, in a way the brain tends to resist thinking about for very long, is that you have never seen the Sun as it is right now. You have only ever seen the Sun as it was, a version of it. A message sent 8 minutes ago arriving just in time for breakfast. Astronomers have a name for this. They call it look-back time. The idea that every source of light in the sky, the moon, the planets, the distant stars, is seen not as it is, but as it was at the moment its light began travelling toward you. The moon about 1¼ seconds ago. Mars, depending on its position in its orbit, anywhere from 3 minutes to 20 minutes in the past. The nearest star beyond our own Sun, a faint point of light in the southern sky, called Proxima Centauri, is seen as it was 4 years and 3 months ago. The night sky researchers have found is not a picture of the present. It is a collection of messages from different depths of the past arriving all at once, layered on top of each other, like letters written at different times delivered on the same afternoon. And we look up at it and call it now. There is something in this that the mind quietly registers even before the science gives it language. A sense, perhaps, that the universe is larger than the moment, that what we perceive and what is actually happening are always to some degree separated by a breath, a small and uncrossable distance between event and awareness. In the case of the Sun, that distance is 8 minutes. Which means if the Sun were to disappear, not dim, not flicker, but simply cease to exist in this moment, we would not know, not for 8 full minutes. The light already travelling toward us would continue to arrive faithful and warm, carrying no information about what had just been lost. The morning would continue to look like a morning. The sky would remain blue, the shadows would fall at their usual angles, and then quietly all at once the light would stop. Scientists who study solar physics describe the Sun's output as remarkably stable over human timescales. It does not flicker the way a candle flickers. It does not pulse with visible irregularity. It burns steadily through a process called nuclear fusion, the conversion of hydrogen into helium at its core, releasing energy in quantities so that the numbers require a moment to settle. Every second, the Sun converts roughly 600 million tons of hydrogen into helium, and in doing so it loses about 4 million tons of mass transformed directly into energy, into the light and heat that crosses 93 million miles to reach this planet. 4 million tons per second for the last 4.5 billion years. Evidence suggests the Sun will continue burning in roughly its current form for another 5 billion years. The timescales are so immense that the human nervous system has no reliable way to hold them. 5 billion years from now in any direction might as well be a kind of forever. And yet the Sun is not permanent. It is a process, a long, slow burning. What we understand so far suggests that the Sun's light does not leave the core instantly. The energy produced by fusion at the Sun's center begins its journey outward through a region called the radiative zone, a dense layer of plasma, so thick that individual photons take an extraordinary amount of time to pass through it. Not 8 minutes, not 8 hours. Scientists estimate between 10,000 and 170,000 years. A photon born in the heart of the Sun today will spend tens of thousands of years bouncing between particles absorbed and re-emitted, travelling in no particular direction, making almost no progress until eventually it reaches the outer layers and erupts into space. and then in 8 minutes and 20 seconds it crosses the void between the sun and the earth and lands on your skin. The warmth you feel on a summer afternoon may carry the energy of a process that began before modern humans existed, before the first cave paintings, before language as we know it, before almost everything we consider history. It may be that this is part of why light feels the way it does, not just warm, but somehow ancient, something the body knows how to receive even without being told. Something that arrives from very far away and is still somehow familiar. Psychologists who study awe and wonder often describe these moments of scale, when a person genuinely grasps the distance or the age of something as quietly destabilizing but not unpleasantly so. The mind loosens slightly. The grip on the immediate and ordinary relaxes. And in that relaxation something else becomes possible. A kind of spaciousness, a gentle widening. The Japanese language has a word, kokoroni shimiru, that is often translated as something that sinks into the heart. A feeling that moves through you not loudly but deeply. Scientists may not study words like this, but the experience they describe is one that people across cultures seem to recognize. That particular quality of something vast being briefly quietly held. Looking at the sky on a clear day, knowing even dimly that the light reaching you left the sun before you woke might be that kind of moment. There is also this: the light does not travel alone. Along with visible light, the sun sends a continuous stream of other radiation, ultraviolet wavelengths, infrared warmth, and something called the solar wind. A flow of charged particles that streams outward from the sun's surface in all directions, filling the space between the planets. This wind takes little longer to arrive than the light, typically 2 to 4 days to cross the distance to Earth. And when it meets our planet's magnetic field, the field bends and absorbs it, deflecting most of the particles around us. It is the interaction between the solar wind and the Earth's magnetic field that creates the auroras. Those slow, silent curtains of green and violet light that appear above the poles on certain nights. So when the sun disappears from the sky during a solar eclipse, or when you imagine a morning without it, you are not just imagining the absence of brightness. You are imagining the absence of warmth, of radiation, of the wind that shapes our magnetic field of the auroras. It quietly paints at the edges of the world. The sun is not just a light source, it is a presence, a constant ongoing relationship between a star and everything that orbits it. Researchers who study total solar eclipses often describe a strange doubling of emotion among observers during the moments of totality. There is wonder almost universally, but alongside the wonder something quieter, something that sits closer to tenderness, to gratitude, to the particular feeling of realizing you love something you had stopped thinking about. The sun, hidden for 2 minutes or 3, becomes briefly precious in a way it never quite manages to be on an ordinary Tuesday. It seems that absence teaches appreciation in ways that presence rarely does, not because the thing changes, but because the mind, suddenly deprived of what it assumed was permanent, catches up to what was always true. The sun was always this extraordinary. 8 minutes of light in transit at every moment. 4 million tons of mass becoming energy every second. Ancient photons completing a 100,000-year journey through plasma to reach the surface of a small planet and warm the face of someone looking up. It was always this. We just needed it to go quiet for a moment before we could hear it. And somewhere in the stillness of that thought, in the space between the going and the returning, there is something else the darkness carries. Something the living world has been listening to for far longer than we have had words for it. Something written not in light, but in its absence. The animals noticed it first. There is a meadow in the path of totality. You cannot see it from where you're lying, but you can imagine it easily enough. A wide open field somewhere in the middle of a continent full of the ordinary sounds of midday. Insects moving through tall grass. a bird finishing a phrase it started 3 seconds ago. Somewhere nearby, a dog resting in a patch of shade, one ear occasionally lifting then settling again. And then almost imperceptibly at first, something begins to change. Not the light, not yet. The light is still there, still filling the field in the way it always fills a field on a clear afternoon. But something else has shifted. Something the instruments cannot easily measure. Something that moves first through the animals before it moves through the sky. Scientists who study animal behavior during solar eclipses have documented something remarkable and consistent across dozens of recorded events. Before totality, sometimes as many as 10 to 15 minutes before the sky visibly darkens, animals begin to change their behavior. And they do not change it the way they might respond to a sudden threat. There is no alarm and no flight, no urgency. The change is quieter than that, more internal. Honeybees, which navigate in part by the angle and intensity of sunlight, return to their hives, not in panic, methodically, purposefully, as if the workday has simply ended. The hum of a beehive during a solar eclipse, researchers have found, decreases measurably in the minutes approaching totality. And then when the sun re-emerges, the bees leave again, going about their routes as though they had simply paused mid-afternoon for a rest they did not know they needed. Birds do something similar. Species that typically fall silent at dusk begin their evening songs. Robins, thrushes, sparrows, the same phrases they offer, the fading light at the end of each day offered now, to a darkness that is arriving at the wrong hour. And when the light returns, some of them sing again their dawn song, their waking song, a full performance of morning, given to the middle of an afternoon that had briefly forgotten what it was. What we understand so far suggests that most animals do not experience time the way we do, as an abstraction, as a clock on a wall. They experience it as light, as temperature, as sound, as the particular chemical signatures that move through the air when the world transitions from one state to another. The circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs sleep and waking in nearly every living organism on Earth, is synchronized above all by light. Not by temperature alone, not by noise, not by social cues, by light first. By the specific quality of light that changes as the sun moves through its arc, and the specific absence of that quality as darkness arrives. A total solar eclipse moves through this system like a false signal. The light drops, the temperature cools, the quality of the air shifts in ways that carry the chemical signature of evening, and the body, every body responds to that signal. Not because it is deceived exactly, but because the body does not ask questions. It simply reads what it is given and responds accordingly. The bees do not know there will be an eclipse. The robins do not know the darkness is temporary. They only know what the light is doing right now. There is a species of orb-weaving spider that has been observed during solar eclipse events, dismantling its web as totality approaches. This is what orb weavers do at the end of each day. They consume their webs, recycling the protein, preparing to rest until morning. During the eclipse, they began this process in the middle of the afternoon, and when the light returned, some of them stopped. Some began to rebuild right there in the middle of what had briefly felt like nightfall, as if the day had offered them a second beginning. Evidence suggests that even single-celled organisms, creatures with no nervous system, no brain, no organs of perception in any sense, we would recognize respond to light cycles. Certain algae change their orientation in water based on the angle of sunlight. Certain bacteria alter their chemical behavior at dawn and dusk. The sensitivity to light is not a feature of complexity. It is a feature of life itself in nearly every form it takes. Light is not just something living things see. It is something they are organized around. The temperature during a total series of solar eclipse drops noticeably, typically between 5 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of a few minutes, depending on geography and season. This cooling is not uniform. The ground, which has been absorbing solar radiation all morning, retains its warmth longer than the air above it. The air cools first and faster. This temperature gradient warm ground suddenly cooling air changes the way the atmosphere moves. Wind patterns near the ground can shift direction during totality, a phenomenon that eclipse observers have been reporting for centuries and that meteorologists have only relatively recently been able to measure with precision. It seems that the atmosphere itself has a kind of memory of warmth and loses it slowly, reluctantly, even as the light disappears above it. Animals feel this, not just birds and insects, mammals too. Cows in fields have been documented moving toward their barns as totality approaches. Horses have been reported standing still, heads lowered in the posture of rest. Zoo animals across multiple documented eclipse events have altered their routines, retreated to shelters, or engaged in behaviors typically associated with the approach of night. The body knows what cooling air means. It has always known. Researchers who have studied the neurological basis of circadian rhythms describe the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that small cluster of cells in the brain's hypothalamus, that functions as the body's master clock, as receiving its primary signal directly from the retina. Special cells in the eye, distinct from the rods and cones used for ordinary vision, detect changes in light intensity and color and send this information directly to the clock. These cells respond particularly to the blue wavelengths of daylight, and they are slow, not fast like ordinary vision, but gradual and accumulating. They are built to measure the arc of a day, not the blink of a flash, which means that during an eclipse, as the light changes slowly over 20 or 30 minutes, these cells are reading the transition carefully, registering the cooling of the color, the softening of the blue, sending signals that say the day is winding down. The hormones of evening may begin. Melatonin, the hormone associated with sleep released naturally by the pineal gland as darkness approaches, has been measured rising in human subjects during total solar eclipses, not dramatically, not in quantities that would cause immediate drowsiness on a street corner in the middle of an eclipse crowd, but measurably, quietly, a whisper of chemistry that is the body saying in its oldest language, rest may be coming, be ready. It may be that this is why eclipse observers so often describe a feeling that is difficult to name. Not just wonder at the visual spectacle, though, that is real and reported universally, but something underneath the wonder, a kind of settling, a loosening of whatever it is that keeps us organized around the pace of the day. The body receiving the signals of dusk at an unexpected hour does something small and involuntary. It begins just slightly to let go. Psychologists often note that the body and the mind are not as separate in their responses as we tend to assume. What the nervous system registers, the consciousness eventually experiences sometimes as feeling, sometimes as a vague sense of something shifting, something softening at the edges. The bees return to their hive, the birds sing their evening song, and somewhere in the crowd of humans standing in a field watching the moon cover the sun, something ancient and very quiet inside each of them does the same. It prepares for rest. It does not know the darkness is temporary. It only knows what the light is doing right now. There is a particular photograph taken during the eclipse of 1999, which passed over Europe in the month of August. In the image, a field of sunflowers, a species that follows the sun across the sky throughout the day through a process called solar tracking, can be seen during totality. Their heads, which had been turning to follow the light since morning, are lowered, not dramatically, not collapsed, but bowed very slightly, turned inward, waiting. When the light returned in the images taken minutes later, the flowers had begun to lift again. A field of plants following a star across the sky, pausing when it disappeared, continuing when it returned. No nervous system, no awareness, only the oldest conversation in the history of this planet, the one between sunlight and the things that grew toward it. Scientists are still exploring the precise chemical mechanisms by which plants track the sun and by which they respond to sudden changes in light quality. What is clear is that the response is real, measurable, and remarkably consistent across species. Life wherever it appears seems to have arrived at the same conclusion: orient toward the light, hold still when it goes. And what researchers discovered when they looked even closer into the chemistry of that stillness, into the quiet that falls over a field when the sun disappears, is something the body has always known, long before any of us had language for it. Something written in the space between light and dark, in the pause between one breath and the next. Part 4. The Sky That Changed Colours. Word count 1850. Runtime 14 minutes. There is a colour that exists only at the edge of things. Not quite orange, not quite pink. Something between them, a shade that appears for only a few minutes each day, in the narrow band of sky just above the horizon at sunrise and sunset, where the light is travelling its longest path through the atmosphere, and the air is deciding what to keep and what to let through. Most people have seen it. Very few have a name for it. Scientists call the conditions that produce it the belt of Venus, a soft rosy arc that appears in the eastern sky at dusk directly opposite the setting sun, marking the boundary between the lit atmosphere above and the shadow of the earth rising below. It is not a metaphor. It is a real optical phenomenon, measured and documented, produced by the backscattering of reddened sunlight off particles in the lower atmosphere. And during a total solar eclipse, this colour, this edge of things colour, appears all around the horizon at once. To understand why the sky changes the way it does during an eclipse, it helps to spend a moment with light itself, not with what light does, but with what it is. Sunlight as it travels from the sun toward the earth is a form of electromagnetic radiation, a stream of energy moving in waves of different lengths. The visible portion of the spectrum, the part that human eyes can detect, spans from the shorter, more energetic wavelengths that the brain interprets as violet and blue to the longer, less energetic wavelengths read as orange and red. When this light enters the Earth's atmosphere, it encounters the molecules that make up the air, primarily nitrogen and oxygen, both far smaller than the wavelengths of visible light. These molecules scatter the shorter blue wavelengths far more readily than the longer red ones. The blue light scatters sideways forward in every direction, flooding the sky from edge to edge with scattered blue. The red and orange wavelengths continue through relatively undisturbed, arriving more or less directly. This is why the sky overhead on a clear day is blue. Not because the atmosphere is blue or because space is blue, but because blue light has scattered so thoroughly that it seems to come from everywhere at once. Evidence suggests that this scattering, named Rayleigh, scattering after the 19th century physicist who first described its mathematics, is also responsible for the redness of sunsets, the whiteness of clouds, and the particular deep indigo of the sky at high altitude, where there is less atmosphere above and therefore less scattering to fill in the colour. It is all the same light arriving from the same source. The colour is not in the light. The colour is in the path it takes to reach your eye. During a solar eclipse, that path changes. As the moon moves across the face of the sun, the available light decreases, but not evenly and not all at once. The reduction happens gradually over the course of an hour or more, with totality itself lasting only minutes. And during that gradual change, the sky undergoes a transformation that is unlike any other phenomenon in ordinary experience. The first thing to change is not brightness, it is quality. Researchers who have measured the spectral composition of light during solar eclipses note that the colour temperature of the sky shifts perceptibly as the sun becomes more and more occluded. The light loses some of its blue. Not dramatically at first, a slight coolness, a slight flatness, as if the afternoon has been turned down like a lamp on a dimmer. Shadows sharpen. This is one of the more counterintuitive effects, with the sun becoming a crescent-shaped source of light rather than a full disk. Shadows cast by leaves and edges become more defined, more precise. Circles of light on the ground, the dappled patterns that appear under trees on sunny days, which are actually tiny projections of the sun's disk through gaps in the foliage, become crescent-shaped, mirroring the occluded sun exactly. A tree's shadow becomes a message from the sky. As totality approaches the horizon, begins to do something that eclipse observers find almost impossible to adequately describe. The sky directly overhead darkens toward a deep twilight blue. Not quite the blue of day, not quite the navy of night, but something that exists between those two states and rarely appears anywhere else. And around the entire horizon, in a 360-degree ring, the light of regions outside the eclipse path is still arriving, undimmed, warm, a continuous sunset seen from all directions at once. The belt of Venus colours, those soft pinks and corals and bronzed oranges, appear on every side simultaneously, as if the Earth has just become an island at dusk, surrounded by the last warmth of a day that has not quite ended anywhere except directly above. It may be that this is why eclipse observers so often describe the experience as surreal. Not frightening, but deeply disorienting in a way that bypasses ordinary categories. The brain tends to interpret colour and light as reliable guides to time and place, to where the day is in its arc, to what comes next, to what the world is currently doing. An eclipse presents a visual field that cannot be mapped to any known moment. It is sunrise and sunset and midday and twilight all at once from every direction. The perceptual system has no file for this. What we understand so far suggests that colour plays a far deeper role in human experience than most of us consciously realise. Researchers studying the psychology of colour and mood have found that the blue wavelengths of daylight, the ones scattered so freely by the atmosphere, have a measurable effect on alertness and cognitive function. The brain receiving blue light through the retina interprets it as information about the time of day and responds by suppressing melatonin, maintaining wakefulness, sharpening attention. As the blue is removed from the sky, as the eclipse deepens, and the light takes on its strange, warm, directionless quality, something in the nervous system responds to the change. Not dramatically, not consciously, but measurably. Studies indicate that certain visual cortex responses change in character during the unusual light conditions of an eclipse as the brain attempts to recalibrate its model of the current environment. The mind quietly registers the wrongness of the colour and does something with it that it does not quite announce. There is a painter, J.M.W. Turner, the English landscape artist of the 18th and 19th centuries, who was known for his extraordinary sensitivity to atmospheric light. He painted skies in ways his contemporaries found excessive, implausible, almost lurid. Colours that did not behave the way colours were supposed to behave. Pinks appearing where there should have been blue, golds bleeding into greys, light seeming to come from inside things rather than from any single source. Art historians have long noted the similarity between Turner's most extreme atmospheric works and the visual conditions produced by unusual natural events, volcanic eruptions in distant parts of the world releasing particulate into the upper atmosphere, changing the scattering properties of light for months at a time. Some of his most luminous colour-saturated paintings correspond in date to years of known atmospheric disruption. Turner may not have understood the optics, but his eye noticed. And what it noticed was real light behaving differently, because the medium through which it travelled had changed. Scientists are still exploring the precise ways that atmospheric composition affects colour perception at the level of individual observation. What is clear is that the human visual system is more sensitive to these changes than most people assume. The eye is not a camera, it is an interpreter, and it has been trained over a lifetime to expect the light to arrive in certain ways. When it does not, something stirs. The corona, the sun's outer atmosphere normally invisible against the brightness of the solar disk, becomes visible only during totality, It extends outward from the darkened sun in feathery irregular streamers, white and silver against the darkened blue, shaped by the complex geometries of the sun's magnetic field. It is one of the most visually extraordinary phenomena accessible to the naked eye. And for most of human history, it was the only moment when the corona could be seen at all. Every major advance in understanding the sun's outer atmosphere, every measurement of its temperature, which reaches an almost incomprehensible 1 million to 3 million degrees Celsius far hotter than the surface below it, came initially from the few precious minutes of totality when the moon covered the sun just enough. The moon, by a remarkable coincidence of relative sizes and distances, is almost exactly the right size to cover the solar disk without obscuring the corona, not too small, not too large, just the precise apparent size in the sky from this particular planet to block the blinding centre and reveal the delicate edges. It is, as scientists often note, with a kind of quiet appreciation an extraordinary accident. Psychologists often note that humans find certain visual stimuli intrinsically calming, and that among the most reliable of these are scenes involving soft, diffuse light, gradual colour transitions, and an absence of sharp contrast. The visual conditions of approaching totality, the gentle dimming, the warm colours spreading around the horizon, the softening of shadows match this profile almost exactly. The eclipse in its visual character resembles nothing so much as the most beautiful moments of twilight extended and made strange, and twilight researchers have found is reliably associated with a downregulation of arousal, a settling of the nervous system, a slowing of the breath. It seems that beauty and rest are not separate categories in the body's response system. They often arrive together in the same quality of light through the same pathway. And somewhere in the chemistry of colour in the pathlight takes through the atmosphere to reach a waiting eye, there is a softness that the body has been reading long before the mind began to ask questions about it. Something that settles quietly in the space where the blue used to be. The light, even when it changes, carries something forward, something accumulated over the whole length of a day, warmth that has been absorbed into the ground, into the walls of buildings, into the surfaces of things that have been sitting in the sun all morning. And it turns out that the earth itself holds this warmth in ways that outlast the light that made it. There is a stone wall somewhere in the south of France that holds the warmth of July well into October, not metaphorically, physically. The limestone absorbs heat slowly across the long summer days, storing it in layers, releasing it back into the air at night when the temperature drops and the warmth is needed. Farmers who have grown grapes in this region for generations know to plant near stone, not because of folklore, but because of something they observed across many lifetimes of watching the same walls in the same light year after year. The stone remembers the summer even when the summer is gone. This is not a poetic idea, it is thermodynamics, and it is one of the quieter, stranger things that happens during a solar eclipse, a phenomenon that reveals in compressed and visible form something that is always true about the physical world, but rarely noticeable in the pace of an ordinary day. When the sun disappears during totality, the air cools. This part most people expect. What they do not always anticipate is the particular way it cools, not uniformly, not all at once, but in layers, in gradients, in a sequence that tells a story about which materials have been absorbing heat and for how long, and how reluctant they are to let it go. The air cools first and fastest. It has little capacity to hold heat. Air is a poor thermal reservoir, thin and easily disturbed. Within 2 or 3 minutes of totality, a measurable drop of 5 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit can occur in the ambient temperature. People standing in eclipse paths consistently report feeling the cold before they fully process the darkness. The skin knows before the mind does. But the ground cools more slowly, and the stone walls, the concrete sidewalks, the brick buildings, the dark soil of open fields, they cool more slowly still. Scientists describe this property as thermal mass or heat capacity, the ability of a material to absorb and store heat energy relative to its volume. Water has an exceptionally high heat capacity. It takes a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down. Rock and concrete are moderate. Air is low. Metal is variable but generally releases heat quickly. This is why coastal cities are milder than inland ones. The ocean nearby has absorbed so much thermal energy over the summer that it releases it slowly through the autumn, buffering the air against sharp temperature swings. The ocean, in a very real sense, is the memory of the summer. It holds what has already passed and gives it back slowly over months. During an eclipse, the same physics plays out in miniature and in minutes. Researchers who have measured temperature gradients during totality have found that the ground surface and the air above it diverge noticeably, the air dropping toward what feels like evening, while the earth beneath still carries the warmth of noon. If you were to lie down in a field during totality and press your palm to the ground, you would feel this: the soil still warm, the air above your face already cool, the earth holding the morning in its surface while the sky has moved on without it. There is a term used in geology and ecology, thermal inertia, that describes the resistance of a material to changes in temperature. High thermal inertia means the material changes temperature slowly, holds what it has been given, and releases it on its own schedule. Low thermal inertia means it responds quickly, heating and cooling almost in step with the conditions around it. Evidence suggests that the thermal inertia of a landscape shapes everything that lives there. Desert ecosystem, where the soil and rock have moderate thermal inertia and the air is dry, experience extreme swings between hot days and cold nights, sometimes of 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, within the space of a few hours. The organisms that survive there are built for this, adapted to the violence of temperature memory. Dense forest ecosystems where water-rich soil and leaf cover maintain more stable temperatures produce different adaptations entirely. What we understand so far suggests that the difference between a thriving ecosystem and a struggling one is often not simply the amount of heat received, but how well the landscape can hold and distribute it. Thermal memory distributed through soil and stone and water is part of what makes a place habitable, part of what makes it feel in some wordless way like somewhere things can rest. The cooling during an eclipse is temporary. The light returns, the air warms, the divergence between ground and sky closes again over the following hour. But the sequence, the way each material releases its stored warmth on its own schedule, the way the air rushed ahead while the earth stayed behind, reveals something that is always happening, just too slowly to see on an ordinary day. Every landscape is in a constant process of receiving heat and releasing it. The ground beneath the city is warmer than the surrounding countryside because it has accumulated decades of absorbed solar energy, supplemented by the waste heat of buildings and machinery and human activity. Ecologists call this the urban heat island effect, and it means that a city centre can be several degrees warmer than the fields 5 miles outside it. Not because more sunlight falls on it, but because the materials it is made of are better at holding what they receive, and because they have been receiving it for longer. The city in a thermal sense has a long memory. It may be that humans have always understood this intuitively, even without the vocabulary of thermodynamics. The preference for south-facing rooms in the northern hemisphere, rooms that receive more direct sunlight, is not just about brightness. It is about warmth, about the particular quality of a room that has been absorbing heat through a window all morning and releases it slowly into the afternoon, creating an environment that feels held, enclosed, safe. The word comfortable has roots that suggest being fortified, strengthened. But in practice, comfort is often thermal, the feeling of a temperature that does not require the body to work to maintain itself. Not too hot, not too cold, temperature the body can rest inside without effort. Neuroscientists have observed that environments within a narrow temperature range roughly 66 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit are associated with lower physiological stress responses. The body's thermoregulatory systems, which are always working to maintain internal temperature, quiet down at these ambient levels. The heart rate settles. The muscles do not need to tense against cold or perspire against heat. The nervous system relieved of that particular task has more capacity for rest. The ideal temperature for sleep researchers have found is at the cooler end of this range or slightly below it. The body prepares for sleep partly by releasing heat from its core to its periphery, allowing the internal temperature to drop by a degree or two. A cool room supports this process. A warm room resists it. The sun's absence, even in the compressed minutes of an eclipse, traces exactly this arc. The air cools, the body registers it. Something in the nervous system reading the temperature drop the same way it reads the cooling of evening begins the familiar adjustments. Not consciously, not as a decision, simply as a response to the information the skin is receiving. The mind quietly registers the temperature as instruction and follows. There is something worth dwelling on in this. The idea that the body does not experience the world primarily as images or sounds or thoughts, but as gradients, as the slow movement of conditions from one state to another, as temperature rising and falling, as light strengthening and softening, as the air thickening with humidity or thinning towards dryness. Studies indicate that human thermoception, the sense of temperature, is one of the oldest sensory systems in the body's evolutionary history. Long before the visual cortex developed its current complexity, long before language and abstract thought organisms were detecting and responding to thermal gradients. Moving toward warmth, moving away from dangerous cold or heat, using temperature as a map of the environment. This sense has not gone away. It has simply been overlaid with newer, louder systems, vision, language, thought. But underneath those layers, it is still there, still reading the world in degrees, still influencing how safe or comfortable or ready for rest the body feels. When a room grows cooler in the evening, the body reads it. When a stone wall releases its stored warmth into the night air, the body reads that too. When the temperature drops 5 degrees in the space of 2 minutes during an eclipse, the body, drawing on something far older than understanding, knows that the world has shifted. It does not ask why, it simply adjusts. Scientists are still exploring the full range of ways that temperature influences not just comfort but cognition, emotion, and the quality of rest. What has emerged from this research so far is a picture of the body as a deeply thermal creature, one for whom warmth and cold are not merely physical conditions but emotional ones. Warmth is associated neurologically with safety and social connection. Cold in small doses is associated with alertness and the preparation for change. The particular combination of warm ground and cool air that occurs during the moments of an eclipse, lying in a field feeling the earth still holding the morning, while the sky has grown strange above, may be one of the more unusual thermal experiences available in the natural world. 2 temperatures at once, the past still held in the soil, the present already moving on above, the body caught between them, resting in both. Warmth, it turns out, is not just a property of surfaces. It accumulates in living things too, in ways that are slow-layered and longer-lasting than we usually imagine. And the stars that appear in the darkened sky during totality, those points of light that are always there, always present, always burning, hold a warmth of their own. A light that has been travelling for years or centuries or thousands of years, arriving just in time to be seen. Part 6. The Stars That Were Always There. Word count 2150. Runtime 16 minutes. On a clear afternoon, the sky above you contains approximately 5,000 stars visible to the naked eye. You cannot see any of them, not because they are too far away, not because the atmosphere is blocking them. They are there, burning, every one of them, some of them larger than the sun by factors that resist easy imagining. Some of them older, some of them in the final stages of their lives, radiating light that has been travelling toward this planet for decades or centuries or longer. They are present. They are real. They are in every meaningful physical sense right there above you. And the only reason you cannot see them is because of one thing: the sun. The sun is not the brightest object that has ever existed. In the scale of the universe, it is a modest star, average in temperature, average in size, unremarkable to any civilization that might be observing it from a sufficient distance. But it is close. And closeness in the matter of light is almost everything. The sun floods the atmosphere with scattered blue light, that same Rayleigh, scattering that fills the daytime sky from edge to edge, and that diffuse brightness raises what scientists call the background luminance of the sky to a level that simply overwhelms the faint signal arriving from other stars. The eye trying to detect a candle in a sunlit room cannot, not because the candle is not burning, but because the room is too bright for the candle to compete. Astronomers describe this as the signal-to-noise ratio of observation. The stars produce a real signal. The sunlit sky produces noise that buries it. And so we go through our days in a universe full of stars beneath a sky containing thousands of them, and we see only blue. During totality, those 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 minutes when the moon covers the sun completely, the noise is removed. The blue sky does not disappear entirely. The horizon still holds its colours, the warm ring of regions beyond the eclipse path. But directly overhead, the scattered light drops low enough that the brightest stars break through. Observers in the path of totality have reported seeing Venus first bright enough to be visible even in partial twilight, and then as the seconds pass, Jupiter, Saturn, and the brighter fixed stars asserting themselves against the darkened sky. The stars do not appear dramatically the way they do in time-lapse videos of night falling. They arrive quietly, one and then another, as if they were always waiting just at the threshold of visibility, pressing gently against the brightness, ready to be seen the moment the conditions allowed. Because that is exactly what they were doing. There is something in this that researchers who study visual perception find particularly interesting. The human eye does not respond to light in a linear way. It responds logarithmically, meaning that a 10-fold increase in actual light intensity produces only a modest increase in perceived brightness. This is why we can see comfortably both in a dimly lit room and in full sunlight, even though the difference in light intensity between those two environments is enormous. This logarithmic response is also why stars become visible so quickly once the sun is removed. The eye does not need the light level to drop all the way to night before the stars appear. It simply needs the overwhelming signal of scattered sunlight to diminish enough that the eye's sensitivity can adjust, and the fainter signals below its previous detection threshold can register. The brain tends to interpret the visual environment in terms of relative brightness, rather than absolute brightness. It is always comparing, always calibrating. What looks dark depends entirely on what it is being compared to. In a darkened eclipse sky, the stars are suddenly within range, and the eye, adjusting rapidly in the way it always adjusts, finds them. The star nearest the sun in the sky during any given eclipse is something eclipse chasers pay particular attention to. In the total solar eclipse of 1919, one of the most scientifically significant eclipse events in modern history, the stars visible in the darkened sky near the sun's position were measured carefully. Their positions were compared to predictions, and what the measurements showed confirmed something that had been theorized but never directly observed. The light from those stars passing close to the sun on its way to Earth was bent. Not by glass, not by any material medium, by gravity itself, by the curvature of space-time in the vicinity of the sun's enormous mass. Albert Einstein had published his general theory of relativity 4 years earlier in the year 1915. Among its predictions was this: that a gravitational field would deflect the path of light passing through it by an amount that could be calculated precisely. The eclipse of 1919 provided the conditions, stars visible near the sun positions measurable to test that prediction directly. The measurements matched. The stars were not where they appeared to be without the sun present. They were shifted very slightly in exactly the direction and by exactly the amount that general relativity predicted. Evidence suggests that the announcement of this result made to the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society in London on the 6th of November 1919 is one of the more dramatic scientific moments of the early 20th century. Albert Einstein, previously known primarily within the physics community, became a figure of worldwide recognition almost overnight. The idea that space itself could curve that light, did not travel in perfectly straight lines, but could be bent by the presence of mass, was genuinely strange to most people in a way that is now difficult to recover. We live in a time when gravitational lensing, the bending of light by massive objects, is a routine tool of observational astronomy. Astronomers use it to study objects that would otherwise be invisible, their light bent around intervening galaxies like light around a curved glass. The universe is full of natural lenses formed by the gravity of things too massive to imagine redirecting light across billions of light years. All of this was first confirmed in those few minutes of eclipse totality, in a darkened sky surrounded by stars that were always there. Measurements were taken that changed the shape of physics. The stars visible during totality are not simply beautiful. They are in a quiet way a lesson in how much is always present that we simply cannot see under ordinary conditions. Scientists who study cognitive attention have found that the human perceptual system is profoundly selective. At any moment, the eyes and brain are receiving far more information than can be processed consciously, and the system copes with this by filtering, by prioritizing, by suppressing signals that fall below some threshold of relevance in the current context. Most of what the world is doing, most of what is present around you at any moment does not reach conscious awareness. This is not a failure of attention, it is how attention works. It is the only way a finite system can function in an environment of near infinite information. But it means that the version of the world we experience at any given moment is a highly edited version. Things are present that we are not registering. Signals are arriving that we are not processing. The stars are burning overhead while we are looking at something else. Psychologists often note a phenomenon called inattentional blindness, the tendency to miss things that are clearly present when attention is directed elsewhere. In a famous study, people watching a video of a basketball game and counting passes failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. Not because the gorilla was hard to see, but because they were looking for something else. The stars during the day are a kind of astronomical inattentional blindness. They are there. The visual system simply has something brighter to attend to. What we understand so far suggests that this principle extends far beyond vision. The nervous system is always selecting, always filtering, always choosing what to bring to the surface of awareness and what to allow to remain in the background. And most of the world remains in the background, present but unregistered, real but unseen. An eclipse in this sense is an act of attention. The overwhelming brightness is briefly removed, and in the quiet it leaves behind something that was always there becomes visible. There is a word in astronomy averted vision that describes a technique used to see faint objects in the night sky. Rather than looking directly at a dim star or nebula, experienced observers learn to look slightly to the side of it. The reason is anatomical. The center of the retina. The fovea is densely packed with cone cells optimized for color and detail but relatively poor at detecting faint light. The periphery of the retina contains more rod cells which are sensitive to low light levels. By looking away from the thing you want to see, you bring more rods to bear on it and it becomes visible. Averted vision, seeing what is faint by not looking at it directly. It may be that some things are like this. noticed only in the periphery, seen only when the brightness of something else is briefly gently removed. The stars during a solar eclipse are one version of this, the quiet things we find ourselves aware of in moments of stillness, in the particular quality of a room at night, in the pause between thoughts, in the slow drift towards sleep, may be another. The universe, it seems, is not empty between the stars. It is full of light travelling in all directions, full of gravitational fields bending that light, full of particles and fields and forces that interact continuously whether or not anything is watching. The darkness between the stars is not absence. It is simply everything the background brightness has been drowning out, and there is a quieter layer to all of this one that most people never consider. Because while the stars were being revealed in that darkened sky, something else was happening. Something not in the light, but in the body receiving it. In the nervous system of every person standing in the path of totality, adjusting, recalibrating, responding to a universe that had briefly made itself a little more visible. What happens inside a person when the familiar is removed and the previously invisible becomes present? That is its own kind of science. And it turns out the body has been researching it quietly for a very long time. Somewhere inside the brain, about the size of a grain of rice, there is a structure that has been keeping time for as long as you've been alive. It does not tick. It does not display numbers. It does not announce itself in any way that the conscious mind can directly perceive. It simply runs continuously, quietly, adjusting its rhythm against the light it receives each day, maintaining a cycle that is approximately 24 hours long and governs nearly every system in the body with a precision that most clocks would envy. It is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it is in the most literal sense your internal sun. The discovery that living organisms possess internal timekeeping mechanisms, biological clocks that run independent of any external cue, is one of the more elegant findings of 20th century biology. Early researchers demonstrated this by placing organisms in environments with no light cues, no temperature changes, no social signals of any kind, and yet the organisms continue to cycle, sleep and waking, activity and rest, hormone release and suppression, all of it continuing on an approximately 24-hour rhythm, even in the complete absence of the external world. The clock was inside, not learned from the environment, built in. In human beings, this internal clock is anchored in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a paired cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons sitting at the base of the hypothalamus just above the point where the optic nerves cross. Its location is not accidental. It sits precisely at the junction of the visual system because its primary function is to receive light information and use it to keep the internal clock synchronized with the external world. Scientists call this synchronization process entrainment, and the agent that performs it, the cue the body uses above all others to set and reset the clock each day, is light. The pathway is direct and dedicated. Special photoreceptor cells in the retina, distinct from the rods and cones used for ordinary vision, discovered only in the early 2000s, contain a photopigment called melanopsin, which is particularly sensitive to short-wavelength blue light. These cells do not contribute to what you see. They contribute to what the body knows about when it is. They project directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, carrying not a visual image but a measurement, the intensity of the ambient light, the color temperature of the sky, whether the world is brightening or dimming, whether morning is coming or evening is falling. The suprachiasmatic nucleus reads this information and adjusts. It communicates outward to the pineal gland, which regulates melatonin, to the adrenal glands, which govern cortisol, to systems that control body temperature, digestion, immune function, cell repair, and dozens of other processes, each of which has its own daily rhythm, each of which is coordinated against the central timekeeper like instruments in an orchestra, following a conductor that no one in the audience can see. During a solar eclipse, this entire system receives a false signal. The light drops. The color temperature shifts from the blue-enriched light of midday toward the warmer, lower-intensity light that typically signals late afternoon or early evening. The melanopsin-containing cells in the retina measure this change and report it faithfully to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The light is diminishing. The color is warming. The day, by all available evidence, appears to be ending. The body receiving these measurements begins the adjustments it always makes at this time of the apparent day. Melatonin, which is normally suppressed by the brightness of midday, begins to rise. Cortisol, which peaks in the morning to support alertness, begins to ease. Body temperature, which follows its own daily arc, receives signals consistent with the approach of evening. None of this reaches conscious awareness as a labeled experience. It arrives as a feeling, a slight heaviness, a loosening of the grip on whatever was just being thought, a sense difficult to explain but familiar that the body is leaning softly in the direction of rest. Eclipse observers in research studies have described exactly this: an unexpected drowsiness, a warmth behind the eyes, a feeling of the body settling in the minutes surrounding totality, not caused by excitement, not by the cold, not by anything they could identify. Simply a quiet pull arriving from somewhere below thought in response to a darkness the brain interpreted as the beginning of night. It may be that this is one of the stranger experiences available in nature. Standing in a field in the middle of the day, surrounded by other waking people in full awareness that an eclipse is occurring, and yet feeling in the body beneath the understanding the unmistakable chemistry of evening. The body receiving its signal, doing what it has always done. There is no override switch. The suprachiasmatic nucleus does not take instructions from the thinking mind. It reads the light and it responds. The thinking mind is informed of the result, not consulted in the process. Neuroscientists have observed that this separation between the systems that govern physiological state and the systems that govern conscious thought is one of the fundamental organizing principles of the brain. The body is always doing things. The mind is largely a narrator of those things, constructing explanations after the fact, attributing intention and reason to processes that were already in motion before the first thought about them had formed. This is not a flaw. It is efficiency. The systems that keep the body alive are too important to be left to the slow and unreliable processes of conscious deliberation. The jet lag that travelers experience crossing multiple time zones is in essence a version of this eclipse effect stretched over days. The external light cues are now misaligned with the internal clock. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, trained to a rhythm established over weeks or months in one time zone, continues running on its previous schedule even as the traveler's environment has shifted. The result is a body that wants to sleep at noon and remain alert at midnight, a digestion that expects food at the wrong hours, a temperature cycle that has not yet adjusted to the new meridian. The body is not wrong, it is simply running on the last reliable information it received. Evidence suggests that the suprachiasmatic nucleus requires approximately 1 day per time zone to fully resynchronize with the new light environment. For a traveller crossing 9 time zones, London to Tokyo for instance, full entrainment to the new schedule takes approximately 9 days. During that period, the body is in a state of internal disagreement, its systems running on slightly different schedules, each adjusting at its own rate. The feeling of jet lag is not simply tiredness. It is the feeling of the body's orchestra playing from different pages of the same score. What we understand so far suggests that the timing of the body's systems is not peripheral to health, it is central to it. Researchers studying circadian biology have found that misalignment between the internal clock and the external environment is associated with a range of physiological effects. Sleep quality degrades, metabolic processes become less efficient, immune responses are less well coordinated, Even the efficacy of certain medications has been found to vary depending on the time of day they are administered, because the cellular machinery they act upon is following its own daily rhythm. The body is not designed to operate at the same intensity all day long. It has a schedule, processes that are best done during waking and processes that are reserved for sleep cellular repair, memory consolidation, the clearing of metabolic byproducts from the brain through the glymphatic system, the growth and regeneration of tissue. These processes do not simply pause during the day and resume at night. They require the specific hormonal and biochemical environment of nighttime to function at all. Sleep is not the absence of waking, it is a distinct biological state that the body moves into with deliberate chemistry at a time determined by light governed by a clock that has been running since before you were born. The darkness of a solar eclipse is not long enough to significantly shift the circadian rhythm. 2 minutes of totality, even 3 or 4, does not move the clock in any lasting way. The melatonin that rises will fall again as the light returns. The suprachiasmatic nucleus will recalibrate. By the time the eclipse is over, the body will have mostly sorted itself out, filing the experience as a brief anomaly in an otherwise ordinary afternoon. But the response is real. The body's reaction to the eclipse darkness is not imagination and not coincidence. It is the same system running the same code, responding to the same input it has always responded to, without asking whether the darkness is real or temporary, or caused by the geometry of orbiting bodies 93 million miles away. The body does not know about orbital geometry, it knows about light. And for a few minutes the light said night. Researchers who study the relationship between light and human well-being have begun to understand what traditional cultures seem to have always known intuitively, that the body needs not just light but the right kind of light at the right time in the right amount. That the distinction between morning light and evening light, between the blue-rich brightness of noon and the warm, dim quality of late evening, is biologically significant in ways that go far beyond simple visibility. The shift toward warmer, dimmer light in the hours before sleep is not merely aesthetic, it is a signal, one the body has been receiving and responding to for its entire evolutionary history. One that says the day is ending, the work of waking is done, the body can now begin the long important work of rest. An eclipse arriving at midday with evening's chemistry whispers the same thing at the wrong hour, and the body, faithful and unhurried, begins to listen. Studies indicate that the quality of the transition into sleep, not just the duration of sleep, but the ease and completeness of the shift from waking to rest, is one of the strongest predictors of how restorative that sleep actually is. A gradual, gentle dimming in the hours before sleep, allowing the melatonin to rise slowly and the body to ease into its nighttime chemistry, produces deeper and more efficient rest than an abrupt transition from bright light to darkness. The body prefers the long approach, the slow withdrawal of light, the gentle gradient from day to night that has characterized the natural world for billions of years. It may be that this is why the quality of rest on a night when the evening came on slowly, when the light faded softly over the course of an hour, when the room grew dim before it grew dark, feels different from the rest that follows. A late night, with screens and overhead lights switched off all at once. Not just different in duration, different in texture, deeper somehow, more complete. The body was given the signal it was designed to receive, and it followed. Somewhere in the machinery of all of this, in the photoreceptors and the circadian clock and the rising and falling of melatonin, there is a simpler truth that all the biology is pointing toward. The body is not separate from the world it lives in. It is made for it, shaped by it over an unimaginable span of time, calibrated to its light, its temperature, its rhythms of warmth and darkness. When the world sends its signals, the body reads them not as information arriving from outside, but as a language it already knows. The eclipse speaks in that language, and even in the middle of an ordinary afternoon the body hears it clearly. What it says in the end is simple. The same thing it has always said when the light begins to leave: rest is coming, let the day go. And beneath that invitation, beneath the chemistry of melatonin and the slowing of the body's systems, there is something older still. Something that was already keeping its own kind of time long before the first human stood in a field watching the sky go dark. Something written not in neurons but in stone. There is a clay tablet in a museum in Syria that is approximately 3,400 years old. It is not large. Not impressive as objects go, a palm-sized piece of baked earth covered in the small wedge-shaped marks of the cuneiform script used by the ancient civilization of Ugarit, a city that once stood on the coast of what is now northern Syria. The tablet was recovered from the ruins of that city, which was destroyed sometime in the late 12th century before the Common Era and never rebuilt. Most of what is written on it is administrative records of grain, records of trade, the ordinary accounting of a civilization managing its resources. But one passage translated by researchers in the 1980s describes something else, something observed on a particular day. A darkness that came over the city in the middle of the afternoon, the sun gone from the sky, a silence that fell over everything. Researchers who study ancient astronomical records believe this tablet contains the oldest known written account of a total solar eclipse dated through careful cross-referencing of astronomical data to the 3rd of May in the year 1375 before the Common Era. 3,400 years ago, someone stood in a city on the coast of the Mediterranean and watched the sky go dark and found it important enough to write down. They are not alone. Across cultures, across millennia, across every inhabited continent, the record of solar eclipses runs through human history like a quiet thread. Oracle bones from the Shang dynasty in ancient China, dating to roughly the 14th century before the Common Era, record solar eclipses alongside predictions and ritual responses. Babylonian astronomers working between the 8th and 5th centuries before the Common Era maintain detailed cuneiform records of eclipses observed from Mesopotamia, records so systematic and so precise that modern astronomers have used them to calculate the subtle changes in Earth's rotation rate over the past 2.5 millennia. The ancient Greeks recorded eclipses with increasing mathematical precision. The philosopher Thales of Miletus is credited perhaps apocryphally with predicting the solar eclipse of the 28th of May in the year 585 before the Common Era, an event which, according to the historian Herodotus, halted a battle between the Lydians and the Medes, the sudden darkness interpreted by both armies as a divine sign that the fighting should stop. Two armies laying down their weapons because the sun disappeared, the eclipse as peacemaker. Scientists who study the history of astronomy have noted that eclipse records from ancient cultures are not merely curiosities. They are data, precise datable observations of a phenomenon that can be modelled mathematically with high accuracy, allowing researchers to use them as anchors in the reconstruction of historical chronology and the measurement of long-term changes in the Earth-Moon-Sun system. The Moon, as it happens, is not staying where it is. It is drifting very slowly away from the Earth, moving outward at a rate of approximately 3.8 centimeters per year, pushed by the tidal interactions between the Earth's oceans and the Moon's gravitational pull. This recession is small, imperceptible on any human timescale, but over centuries and over millennia it accumulates. And because the Moon's apparent size in the sky depends on its distance from Earth, this slow outward drift means that the Moon's disk, as seen from Earth, is very slowly shrinking, not visibly, not in any way a person would notice within a lifetime or 100 lifetimes, but measurably if you have data spanning thousands of years. The ancient eclipse records provide exactly this. By comparing the calculated paths of eclipses predicted from astronomical models against the recorded locations of ancient observers, researchers can detect tiny discrepancies. Small differences that accumulate over centuries and reveal the moon's changing orbit. The clay tablets, the oracle bones, the Babylonian cuneiform records, they are not just history, they are instruments. There is something quietly moving about this. The idea that the observations of people who lived more than 3,000 years ago, who had no knowledge of orbital mechanics or the physics of gravity, who were simply standing in their cities watching the sky with eyes not so different from yours, that those observations are now part of the scientific record, that their careful attention to a strange afternoon is still useful, still telling us things about the world. The Babylonian astronomers working over generations identified what they called the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours after which the Sun, Earth and the Moon return to nearly the same relative geometry and a nearly identical eclipse occurs. Not in the same place, the 8-hour discrepancy means the Earth has rotated by 1/3 of its circumference, shifting the eclipse path westward by about 120 degrees of longitude. But the same type of eclipse with the same duration of totality are co-occurring with the predictability of clockwork. They found this pattern without telescopes, without mathematics beyond basic arithmetic, simply by watching and recording and watching again for long enough that the pattern revealed itself. It seems that the universe is not stingy with its patterns. It offers them to anyone who is patient enough to look. The ancient Chinese astronomical tradition maintained records of solar eclipses stretching back more than 2,000 years with an institutional structure specifically designed to observe and record celestial events. The Bureau of Astronomy in various forms operated continuously for roughly 2 millennia, employing astronomers whose duty it was to watch the sky and document what they saw. The cultural weight attached to solar eclipses in ancient China was significant. An eclipse was understood as a disruption of the cosmic order, a moment when the ordinary agreement between heaven and earth was briefly suspended. Rituals were performed to assist the sun's return. Drums were beaten. Officials gathered in the courtyards of government buildings to observe and record. Evidence suggests that some of these records are accurate enough to be used in modern astronomical calculations. The dates match. The predicted paths match. The observations made by people who believed they were witnessing a cosmological event of profound importance happen to be scientifically precise. The explanation for the eclipse understood differently across the centuries does not change the quality of the observation. In the Western tradition, the first serious attempt to predict eclipses mathematically is generally attributed to the ancient Greeks, though the Babylonians had already identified the Saros cycle empirically. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century before the Common Era, made measurements of the moon's distance from Earth during a solar eclipse by comparing the depth of totality observed from different latitudes, an elegant use of geometry that produced a surprisingly accurate result. The moon's distance from Earth, measured by a man on an island in the Mediterranean using only angular measurements and logic more than 2,000 years before the invention of radar or laser ranging. Researchers who study the history of science often describe this period as one of the more remarkable examples of what careful observation and systematic reasoning can produce in the absence of technology. The ancient astronomers did not have the tools we have, but they had time and attention and the willingness to build knowledge slowly, one observation at a time across generations. The knowledge they built is still in use. What we understand so far suggests that the practice of watching the sky, of attending to the movements of celestial bodies with patience and precision, has been one of the most consistent human activities across recorded history. Every civilization that has left written records has left astronomical records. Not because the sky is merely decorative, but because it was for most of human history the primary tool for measuring time, navigating geography, and predicting the seasons that governed agriculture and survival. The sky was the clock, the calendar, and the compass. and solar eclipses as dramatic interruptions of the most fundamental celestial rhythm demanded to be recorded. Psychologists often note that humans are pattern-seeking by nature, that the brain is constantly constructing models of how the world works and updating them against experience. An eclipse arriving without warning and briefly overturning the most reliable pattern in the sky would have presented an urgent challenge to any such model. The instinct to record it, to tell others about it, to integrate it into the story the community was telling about the world. This is not superstition, it is cognition. The brain encountering the unexpected and working carefully to understand it. There is an eclipse recorded in the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Amos, describing a darkness at noon that some biblical scholars and astronomers have cross-referenced with a solar eclipse calculated to have occurred over the ancient Near East on the 15th of June in the year 763 before the Common Era. The language describes the sun going down at midday, the earth darkening on a bright day, imagery that to readers familiar with the physical experience of totality is immediately recognizable. Whether the connection is correct, whether the text describes this specific eclipse or something else, is a question scholars continue to discuss. But the fact that the connection can even be investigated, that astronomical calculations and ancient texts can be set alongside each other and compared, is itself remarkable. The eclipse of 763, if it is the one described, passed over the ancient world and was witnessed by people who wrote about it, whose words survived the destruction of their civilization, whose descendants copied those words onto new scrolls, who are the reason the words still exist today. The light of that eclipse is gone, but the record of it remains, still readable, still a witness. There is a phrase used by researchers in archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient peoples understood and recorded astronomical phenomena, that captures something worth sitting with. They describe ancient astronomical records as reaching across time, not metaphorically, but functionally. The knowledge does move across time. The observations made by Babylonian astronomers in the 7th century before the Common Era are reaching us now in the 21st century, and we are still receiving information from them. The mind quietly registers what this means for the scale of human attention. That a person standing on a riverbank in ancient Mesopotamia looking up at a sky going dark chose to mark it down, and that mark is still here. Still part of the story. There is a continuity in this that is worth feeling, if only for a moment. The same sky, the same phenomenon, the same instinct to notice and to record. The observation did not end when the observer's life did. It kept going. In the 21st century, the path of every solar eclipse visible from Earth for the next several thousand years has been calculated and mapped. The dates, the paths, the durations of totality, all of it available, derived from the same orbital mechanics that the Babylonians were beginning to feel their way toward, with their careful clay tablets and their patient generations of watching. The eclipse of April 8, 2024, which crossed North America from the coast of Mexico through Texas and the central states and up through New England into Canada, was watched by an estimated 32 million people who placed themselves deliberately in the path of totality. They drove for hours, flew across the country, stood in fields and on rooftops and in the parking lots of shopping centres waiting for a darkness they had planned for months. The instinct to witness, it seems, has not faded. The clay tablet from Ugarit and the crowd in a Texas field are separated by 3,400 years. They share between them exactly one thing: a sky going dark in the middle of the afternoon, and the human decision to pay attention. Every observation across those millennia is part of the same long conversation between the sky and the people beneath it, between the event and the record of the event, between a world that keeps turning and a species that keeps watching and writing down what it sees. And in all of that, watching across all of those centuries, certain things were noticed. Patterns in the geometry of the sky that pointed towards something else something about the particular extraordinary relationship between this planet and its moon. A coincidence so precise it almost does not seem like one. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, and the sun is 400 times farther away. These two facts sitting alongside each other produce something that has no business existing, a coincidence so precise, so geometrically improbable that scientists who study it tend to reach for careful measured language and then fall briefly quiet. Because what these two numbers mean when you let them settle is this: from the surface of the Earth, the moon and the sun appear to be almost exactly the same size in the sky. Not approximately, not roughly, almost exactly. Within a fraction of a percent depending on where each body is in its orbit, the disk of the moon and the disk of the sun subtend the same angle to a human eye standing on this particular planet. And it is because of this, only because of this, that total solar eclipses exist at all. If the moon were slightly smaller or slightly farther away, it would pass across the face of the sun without covering it completely. The result would be an annular eclipse, a ring of sunlight visible around the moon's edge, bright enough to wash out the corona, bright enough that the sky would not truly darken, the stars would not appear, the colours at the horizon would not transform. The particular, almost otherworldly experience of standing in totality would simply not be available. If the moon were slightly larger or slightly closer, it would cover the sun completely, but would also obscure the corona, the delicate outer atmosphere that streams in white filaments beyond the disk. The scientific opportunity that confirmed Einstein's general relativity would not have existed. The corona, which scientists are still exploring to understand why it is so much hotter than the solar surface below it, would remain hidden behind a disk too large to reveal its edges. The moon is the precise size at the precise distance to cover the bright face and reveal the dim halo, to block just enough and no more. This is by any reasonable assessment extraordinarily unlikely, and it is, as far as scientists can determine, entirely accidental. The moon formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago in the early history of the solar system, when a Mars-sized body, sometimes called Theia, collided with the young Earth at an oblique angle. The collision was not a gentle one. It was an impact of a scale difficult to hold in the mind, a body roughly the size of Mars travelling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, striking the Earth and partially merging with it, ejecting an enormous cloud of vaporized rock and metal into orbit around the young planet. That debris, the remains of two worlds mixed and cooling, gradually coalesced under gravity into a single body, the Moon. Researchers who study the composition of lunar rocks brought back by the Apollo missions have found that the Moon's material is remarkably similar to the Earth's mantle, more similar in fact than it is to the composition of other bodies in the solar system. This is consistent with the giant impact hypothesis. The Moon is in a meaningful sense made partly of Earth, torn from it, reformed and placed in orbit where it has been ever since. The size it ended up, the distance it settled at, these were consequences of the physics of that collision, not designed, not arranged, simply what the numbers produced, and the numbers produced a perfect fit. But here is what makes this even more quietly remarkable, and this is the detail that scientists who study the Earth-Moon system tend to mention with a particular kind of careful understatement. It will not always be this way. The Moon is moving away from the Earth. As described in the previous stretch of this night, the tidal forces between the Earth's oceans and the Moon's gravity are gradually transferring rotational energy from the Earth to the Moon's orbit, pushing the Moon outward at approximately 3.8 centimeters per year. This number is not estimated, it is measured directly using laser reflectors left on the lunar surface by Apollo astronauts, from which the Moon's precise distance can be determined by timing how long it takes a laser pulse to travel to the surface and return. 3.8 centimeters per year, slightly less than an inch and a half. Over a human lifetime, this amounts to roughly 6 feet. Imperceptible, meaningless in any practical sense within the span of a life. But over geological time, over the hundreds of millions of years that the Earth has existed and will continue to exist, it accumulates into something significant. Approximately 600 million years from now, the Moon will have drifted far enough from the Earth that its apparent size in the sky will no longer be sufficient to cover the Sun's disk completely. The era of total solar eclipses will end, not with any particular event, not with any observable transition, just a gradual millimeter by millimeter recession, until one day the Moon passes across the Sun and leaves a ring of light around its edge, and the corona remains hidden, and the stars do not appear, and the sky does not darken to that particular shade of deep twilight blue. After that day, which is not a day any human will witness, which is more distant from us than the earliest single-celled life is from the present, total solar eclipses will no longer occur on Earth. They will simply end, quietly, without announcement. Scientists who study the deep history of the Earth have found evidence suggesting that the Moon was significantly closer to the Earth in the distant past. Billions of years ago, the Moon may have appeared visibly larger in the sky, large enough that the difference would have been noticeable had there been eyes to see it. The tides driven by this closer Moon would have been dramatically stronger, affecting ocean circulation, coastal erosion, and possibly the conditions in which early life developed in shallow marine environments. The Moon's slow recession is not just a geometric curiosity. It is part of the story of how the Earth has changed over its lifetime, and how those changes have shaped the conditions for life. We are living in the middle of this story. The Moon is neither as close as it once was, nor as far as it will eventually be. We happen to exist at the particular moment in the Earth's history when the Moon's size and distance produce with extraordinary precision the only phenomenon that allows the Sun to be completely hidden without being completely obscured. It may be that this is the definition of a good moment to exist. Evidence suggests that total solar eclipses have been occurring on Earth for at least 1 billion years and possibly longer, though the ancient eclipses would have looked different with the Moon appearing slightly larger than it does today, covering the Sun with more margin to spare. As the Moon receded and the apparent sizes converged toward equality, the precision of the fit increased and the corona became gradually more visible at the edges during totality. The eclipse that the Ugaritic scribe recorded in 1575 before the Common Era would have been very similar to the eclipses we see today. The one that the Babylonians used to establish the Saros cycle would have been nearly identical. The geometry was already by then essentially what it is now. For the past few thousand years of recorded human history, the Moon has been almost exactly the right size. Every eclipse record in the human archive, every clay tablet, every oracle bone, every medieval chronicle, every 19th century expedition mounted specifically to observe totality describes the same geometry we have now, the same narrow annula of corona, the same few minutes of darkness, the same stars appearing in the same darkened sky. They were all happening in the window, the same window we are still in. There is a concept in astronomy called the circumstellar habitable zone, the range of distances from a star within which a planet can maintain liquid water on its surface given the right atmospheric conditions. Earth sits comfortably within the Sun's habitable zone. This much is often discussed. Less often mentioned is a second coincidence. The Earth also happens to orbit at a distance from the Sun that places it within what some researchers have informally called the eclipse zone, the narrow range of distances from the Sun at which a moon of the Moon's size would appear the same angular diameter as the Sun. Too close and the Moon appears too large, too far and the Moon appears too small. Earth, it turns out, sits right in the middle. The planet capable of supporting life also happens to be the one with a moon that fits exactly over the Sun. The planet with eyes is also the one given the opportunity to see the corona. Whether this means anything, whether it is a coincidence profound enough to require some explanation beyond probability, is a question that scientists are careful about and philosophers less so. What we understand so far suggests it is a coincidence. A deep and improbable one, but a coincidence nonetheless. The universe produces a very large number of planets and moons over a very long time, and eventually some of them will end up in unusual geometric relationships with their stars. This is perhaps true, and it does not make the thing any less extraordinary to stand beneath. Psychologists often note that human beings respond to rarity differently depending on whether the rarity is permanent or temporary. A flower that blooms for one day is experienced differently from a flower that blooms for 1 hour. A phenomenon that will eventually cease and that we happen to be alive to witness carries a particular emotional weight, not of sadness necessarily, but of something adjacent to gratitude. The specific quality of attention that arises when you know a thing will not always be available. Total solar eclipses will continue for approximately 600 million more years. This is not urgency. It is not a reason for distress. It is simply a fact that when held quietly adds a dimension to the experience that it would not otherwise have. We did not create this alignment. We did not arrange the moon at this distance or ensure that it would be the right size. We arrived already living in a window that had opened long before us and will remain open long after on a planet with eyes under a sky where the moon fits perfectly over the sun. And on certain days on those narrow paths traced across the continents, the window opens all the way. The moon drifting outward on its slow and patient arc does not know that it is creating something irreplaceable. It is simply responding to physics, to the tidal forces that have been nudging it outward since the beginning. It does not know about the corona, or the stars that appear in the darkened sky, or the humans standing in fields with their faces turned upward. It is just moving, slowly, a little farther each year, and the shadow it casts crossing the face of the earth will cross it again and again for longer than the entire span of recorded human history multiplied many thousands of times over. We are nowhere near the end of this. The window is wide open, and yet it is not permanent. That too is part of what it is. There is something the mind does with that information if you let it sit long enough. Something quiet and a little difficult to name. Not urgency, not grief. Something closer to the feeling of being present. Of being here now in the particular moment that allows this particular thing to be seen. The moon will continue its slow recession through all of the remaining time in the window. Steadily, imperceptibly year by year, following the physics of tides and orbits, and the long mathematics of the solar system. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, a kind of readiness, a quiet attention for exactly the moment when the light goes, and the ordinary world pauses, and something larger than ordinary life briefly becomes visible in the dark. What happens in those moments when the light returns and the body begins its slow recalibration back toward day? That too has its own science, gentle and worth following. The first thing that returns is not the warmth. It is not the blue of the sky or the full brightness of midday or the familiar weight of an ordinary afternoon reasserting itself. The first thing that returns in the seconds after the moon begins its slow withdrawal from the face of the sun is a single point of light at the edge of the lunar disk. Astronomers call it the diamond ring effect. As the moon moves and the first sliver of the solar surface re-emerges, the light concentrates briefly focused by the geometry of the moment into a single blazing point against the dark limb of the moon, with the faint ring of the corona still visible around it. For a few seconds it looks exactly like what it is named for, a ring of pale light and one brilliant point burning, and then within moments the light spreads, the sliver widens, the sky begins its slow reclamation of its own brightness. The eclipse is ending, the day is coming back. What follows totality is in scientific terms the reverse of what preceded it but experienced entirely differently. The approach of totality carries a quality of anticipation of something building, of the world moving toward a threshold. The return of the light carries something quieter, something that does not have quite the same vocabulary. Researchers who have studied the psychological experience of eclipse observers describe the aftermath of totality with some consistency. There is a kind of adjustment period, not distress, not disorientation, but something closer to the feeling of waking from a particularly vivid dream. The world is the same as it was before. The light is returning, the colours normalising the sky, resuming its familiar role. And yet something in the nervous system is still in the process of returning from wherever it went during those few minutes of darkness. It seems that the re-entry is its own experience, not simply the reversal of the entry, but something with its own texture and its own pace. The human visual system, in returning to full daylight after the relative darkness of totality, goes through a process called light adaptation, the counterpart to the dark adaptation that allowed the stars to appear during totality. In dark adaptation, the rods of the retina increase their sensitivity over several minutes, allowing vision to function at lower light levels. In light adaptation, the process runs in the opposite direction, and it runs much faster. Within about a minute of re-exposure to full daylight, the visual system has largely recalibrated. The pupils constrict. The photoreceptors adjust their sensitivity. The brain recalibrates its reference point for what counts as bright and what counts as dark. The rapidity of light adaptation compared to dark adaptation reflects something about the asymmetry of the environments we evolved in. The transition from darkness to bright light was in evolutionary terms a more urgent situation, requiring quick recalibration to avoid missing something important in a well-lit environment. The transition from light to dark was slower, and the body could afford to take more time. The eclipse compresses both of these transitions into a span of minutes. Entry and exit adaptation and readaptation within the length of an afternoon. But the sky does not simply return to what it was before, not immediately, not in one step. As totality ends and the partial phase of the eclipse resumes, the moon, continuing its transit, uncovering the sun gradually over the following hour, the light rebuilds in increments. The quality of the sky during this debrightening phase is in some ways more subtle than the darkening. The approach of totality has a kind of dramatic inevitability to it. The return of light is gentler, more contemplative. Shadows that had sharpened to crescent shapes during the partial phase before totality begin to soften back toward normal. The crescent light patterns beneath the trees, those tiny projections of the sun's shape that have been casting unusual shadows on the ground, gradually fill back in as the solar disk re-emerges, becoming less defined, less geometrically precise, resolving back into the ordinary dappled light of an afternoon under trees. Evidence suggests that this gradual normalization, the slow return to the familiar, carries its own distinct quality of experience. Psychologists who study the phenomenon of returning to baseline after an emotionally or perceptually significant event describe a period they call recalibration, during which the nervous system is actively comparing the current state of the world against its updated expectations. The experience is not neutral. It tends to be accompanied by a particular kind of clarity, a sharpened perception of the ordinary, as if the brief interruption has refreshed the eye's relationship with everything it had stopped noticing. The ground, still carrying the warmth it held through totality, begins to exchange heat with the air above it as the sun re-establishes itself. The air, which had cooled quickly during totality, begins its slower return to midday temperatures. The temperature gradient between the ground and the air, that quality of warm earth and cool air that characterized the eclipse's deepest minutes, gradually evens out. Wind patterns near the surface, which had shifted during totality in response to the sudden cooling, begin to reorient. Researchers who have made detailed measurements of near-surface meteorology during eclipses have documented this recovery period with interest, noting, that the atmosphere does not simply spring back to its pre-eclipse state. It recovers gradually, each layer on its own schedule, the surface warming first, the layers above following. The atmosphere has memory too, not as long as the oceans, not as long as stones, but present. The eclipse leaves a trace in the air for longer than the darkness itself. The biological world recovers in the same layered way. The honeybees that return to their hives during the approach to totality begin to re-emerge as the light rebuilds. Studies indicate that the resumption of foraging activity among bee colonies after a solar eclipse follows a pattern similar to the resumption of activity after an unusually dark storm passes, cautious at first, increasing as the light stabilizes, returning to full productivity within roughly the same time it takes the sky to fully re-brighten. The birds that sang their evening songs in the middle of the afternoon do something interesting. Observers have noted that some species, after totality ends and the light returns, sing their dawn chorus again, the full sequence of territorial and greeting calls that they give each morning as the sky brightens. As if the re-emergence of light constitutes for the bird's nervous system a second morning, a reset, another beginning. The day experienced twice, dawn and dusk and dawn again within the span of a few hours. There is something in this that neuroscientists have observed in human subjects following significant perceptual events. The brain's default mode network, a set of interconnected regions that are active during rest self-reflection, and the processing of internally generated thought, shows a characteristic pattern of increased activity in the period following a novel or emotionally resonant experience. This is understood to be part of the consolidation process, the way the brain integrates what has just happened into its ongoing model of the world. People standing in the path of totality in the minutes after the light returns are often noticed to be quieter than they were before. Not somber, not distressed quiet. Processing. The conversations that do happen tend to be lower in volume, slower in pace, oriented not toward planning or logistics but toward the experience itself. People describing what they just saw to the person standing next to them, trying to find language for something that resisted language. Psychologists often note that experiences which exceed the capacity of existing categories to contain them tend to produce exactly this: a period of quiet afterward, a sense of needing to let the experience settle before returning to ordinary discourse. The eclipse creates this, reliably, almost universally, among observers. What we understand so far suggests that this settling period is not idle. The brain is doing something during those quiet minutes after totality. The default mode network is active, integrating the experience, filing it, updating the model of the world to include this event. The emotional processing centers are working through what was felt. The memory systems are consolidating what was seen. It may be that the quiet after a significant experience is as important as the experience itself, that the integration, the settling, the slow return to ordinary consciousness, this is where the experience becomes a memory, where what happened becomes part of who you are. The eclipse does not end at the diamond ring, it continues more quietly inside. The return of light after totality follows a predictable arc governed by orbital mechanics as precisely as the eclipse itself. The duration of the partial phases, the hour or more of gradual dimming before totality, and the corresponding hour or more of gradual rebrightening after, is not random. It reflects the geometry of the moon's shadow falling across the Earth, the relative speeds of the moon's orbit and the Earth's rotation, the angle at which the shadow's edge crosses the landscape. Every eclipse has a slightly different partial phase duration depending on the geometry of that particular event. Some approach slowly and depart slowly. Some move quickly. The duration of totality itself varies from a few seconds at the edges of the path to a maximum of approximately 7.5 minutes at the center line, depending on the moon's distance from Earth at the time, and therefore the size of its apparent disk. The longest total solar eclipse of the 21st century will occur on July 16, 2186, and will last approximately 6 minutes and 55 seconds at its point of greatest totality, passing over the open ocean north of Indonesia. In all likelihood, it will be witnessed by very few people. There is no land in the path. The ships or aircraft that might carry eclipse chasers to the center line of that remote swath of ocean have not yet been built. It will happen in the middle of the Pacific in near perfect silence. The light always returns. This is the one constant across every eclipse in the historical record, across every eclipse that will occur for the next 600 million years. The darkness is always temporary. The geometry of the solar system ensures it. The moon moves on, the shadow lifts. The light rebuilds itself across the landscape with the same slow patience with which it diminished. Researchers who study the psychological aftermath of eclipse events have noted something that they describe carefully, not wanting to overclaim. Among people who have experienced totality, particularly first-time observers for whom the experience has no prior category, the return of light is frequently accompanied by something that the observers themselves describe as an unexpected sense of gratitude. Not relief exactly, not the sharp exhale of fear released, something quieter and less directed than that. Gratitude for the light, which had been there every day before unremarked. The brain tends to reset its reference points in response to contrast. What we appreciate is shaped by what we have briefly been without. The warmth of a room is most felt when you have just come in from the cold. The comfort of stillness is most present just after noise. The familiarity of ordinary daylight, the unremarkable taken for granted brightness of an ordinary afternoon, becomes in the minutes after totality briefly luminous, not permanently. The effect fades as the brain updates its baseline, as the extraordinary recedes back into the ordinary, as the afternoon reasserts its ordinary claims on attention, and the eclipse joins the archive of things that happened and will be remembered and occasionally described to other people. But for those few minutes, as the light rebuilds and the shadows normalize and the birds settle back into their afternoon rhythms and the temperature begins its slow climb back toward noon, there is a quality of perception that is difficult to name and easy to feel. The world for a little while looks exactly like itself, and that it turns out is enough. The recovery of light after an eclipse is slow enough to follow if you are paying attention. You can watch the crescent shapes beneath the trees fill in. You can feel the air warm against your skin. You can watch the sky move from that particular deep twilight blue back through a lighter blue, and then into the full brightness of midday, each step visible if you are not rushing. It is a rare thing to be able to watch the day reconstitute itself, to be present for the return of something so ordinary that it usually arrives without notice. The light comes back the same way it always leaves, gradually, gently, without announcement, and in the quiet of that return, in the settling that follows, something witnessed and absorbed the body finds its way back to its own familiar rhythms. The biology of the afternoon reasserting itself, the clock resynchronizing, the chemistry of waking making its gentle concessions to the chemistry of rest. Every eclipse ends in ordinary daylight. The same afternoon that was interrupted continues, the same world resumes. And yet the people who stood in the path of that shadow carry something forward with them, not knowledge exactly, something less definable than knowledge, something about scale, about time, about the particular feeling of standing on a planet in a solar system in an era of the universe, when the geometry of one star and one moon produces for a few minutes on a narrow strip of ground the most extraordinary sight the natural world has to offer. The light always returns, and somehow afterward it looks a little different than it did before. What the scientists who have studied eclipses and the humans who have witnessed them and the ancient observers who wrote them down on clay and bone and parchment all seem to have arrived at in their different ways is something quiet and resistant to summary. That the light matters more when you have stood in its absence. That the ordinary is not ordinary exactly when you have watched it disappear and return. And that the afternoon which follows an eclipse carries for those who are present a quality of attention that is worth following wherever it leads next. There is a photograph taken on the island of Principe, off the west coast of Africa, on the 29th of May 1919. It is not a beautiful photograph. The equipment was heavy, the conditions were difficult. The expedition had travelled by sea for weeks to reach this small island in the Gulf of Guinea, chosen not for its scenery or its accessibility, but for one reason only. It lay within the path of totality of a solar eclipse that would last approximately 6 minutes and 51 seconds at its centerline, making it one of the longer eclipse events of the early 20th century. The man who organised the expedition was Arthur Eddington, an English astronomer and physicist. The photograph he brought back, a glass plate image showing the positions of stars near the eclipsed sun, would within months be announced to the world as proof of something that had never been directly confirmed before. That space itself could bend. To understand what Eddington was measuring, it helps to begin with the question he was trying to answer. Albert Einstein, in his General Theory of Relativity published in the year 1915, had proposed a radical revision of how gravity works. In the Newtonian understanding that had governed physics for more than 2 centuries, gravity was a force acting between masses across empty space. In Einstein's formulation, gravity was something different. A curvature of space-time itself produced by the presence of mass through which other objects moved along the curves the mass created. One of the predictions of this theory was precise and testable. A ray of light passing close to a massive object would follow the curve of space-time that object produced, and would therefore appear to an observer to come from a slightly different direction than it actually originated. The more massive the object and the closer the light ray passed, the greater the deflection. Einstein calculated the exact amount by which starlight passing close to the sun should be deflected 1.75 arc-seconds, an almost incomprehensibly small angle, less than 1,000th of a degree, and he knew exactly how to test it. If you could photograph the positions of stars near the sun's edge, and compare those positions to where the same stars appeared when the sun was not in that part of the sky, the difference, if it existed, and if it matched his prediction, would confirm the theory. The problem was visibility. Stars near the sun cannot be photographed in ordinary daylight. The sky is too bright. The sun's disk is overwhelming, except during a total solar eclipse. Researchers who have studied the 1919 expedition in detail describe it as a logistically complicated undertaking, conducted under less than ideal conditions. Eddington travelled to Principe. A second team led by Andrew Crommelin travelled to Sobral in northern Brazil, also within the eclipse path, providing a second set of measurements to confirm or contradict Eddington's results. The weather on Principe was uncertain. Clouds threatened throughout the morning. As totality began, the sky was partially overcast, and Eddington worked through the brief window of darkness with the particular focused attention of a person who has travelled very far and cannot afford not to succeed. He exposed 16 photographic plates during the eclipse. Of these, only 2 showed the stellar field he needed, and only 1 was of sufficient quality for reliable measurement. From that single plate, that one glass image taken through intermittent cloud on a small island in the Atlantic during 6 minutes of borrowed darkness, measurements were made that confirmed Einstein's prediction to within observational error. The deflection was real. The light had bent. The announcement was made in London on the 6th of November 1919, at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society. The President of the Royal Society, described the result as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human thought. The next day, the newspapers reported it across 2 continents. Einstein, previously known primarily within the physics community, became a figure of international recognition within the space of a week. What we understand so far suggests that this moment, a solar eclipse confirming a theory about the curvature of space-time, represents one of the most consequential intersections of astronomical opportunity and physical theory in the history of science. The eclipse did not create the theory. Einstein's equations were complete and published 4 years before the expedition. But the eclipse provided the only natural laboratory in which the prediction could be tested with the technology available. Without the eclipse, general relativity would have remained unconfirmed for years, perhaps decades. The experimental physics required to test it, otherwise the precision instruments, the methods for bending light in controlled conditions did not exist in 1919. The eclipse provided a window that no laboratory could replicate. General relativity, once confirmed, did not remain a theoretical curiosity. It became foundational infrastructure. The global positioning system. The network of satellites that allows navigation devices to determine location to within a few meters requires corrections based on general relativity to function accurately. Clocks on satellites run at slightly different rates than clocks on Earth's surface, because they experience a weaker gravitational field. Without accounting for this relativistic effect, cumulative errors in position would reach several kilometers per day. Every time a navigation system correctly identifies a location, it is in a small way applying the theory confirmed by Arthur Eddington on a cloudy island in the Gulf of Guinea during a solar eclipse in the spring of 1919. The bent light of that afternoon is still working, but the 1919 eclipse was not the only one to advance science in significant ways. Each eclipse, as researchers have found, provides opportunities available at no other time, and the history of solar physics is in meaningful part a history of what was discovered during those narrow windows of totality. Helium, the second most abundant element in the universe. The element that fills balloons and exists in the cores of every star was discovered in the Sun before it was found on Earth. During the solar eclipse of August 18, 1868, the French astronomer Jules Janssen observed the solar chromosphere, the thin layer of the Sun's atmosphere just above its surface, and detected a spectral line that did not correspond to any known element. The English astronomer Norman Lockyer, analysing the same data independently, proposed that the line represented a new element, one present in the Sun, but not yet known on our planet. He named it helium from the Greek word for sun. 27 years later, in the year 1895, the Scottish chemist William Ramsay detected the same spectral signature in a mineral on Earth. The element had been hiding in terrestrial rocks all along, but it was found in the Sun first during an eclipse, when the chromosphere was briefly visible without the overwhelming brightness of the disk behind it. The corona, that feathery halo of the Sun's outer atmosphere, visible only during totality, has been the subject of scientific study for as long as total eclipses have been systematically observed. And it has, for most of that history, presented a puzzle that scientists are still exploring. The surface of the Sun, the photosphere, the bright disk we see on ordinary days, has a temperature of approximately 5,500 degrees Celsius. Moving outward from this surface, you would expect the temperature to decrease as it does when you move away from any heat source. But the corona is not cooler. It is dramatically hotter, reaching temperatures between 1 million and 3 million degrees Celsius, hundreds of times hotter than the surface below it. This is, in terms of basic thermodynamics, deeply strange. Heat does not normally flow from a cooler region to a hotter one. The corona should not be as hot as it is, and yet it is, consistently, measurably. Every eclipse observation of the corona confirms the same thing. The mechanism responsible what is heating the corona to such extreme temperatures has been studied for decades and remains an active area of research. The leading hypotheses involve the complex magnetic field lines that extend from the sun's surface into the corona, and the way energy is transferred along them through wave-like oscillations and sudden reconnection events, but the full picture is not yet settled. It may be that the corona is still keeping something to itself, some final detail of its physics waiting for the right instrument or the right eclipse to give itself away. Eclipses have also contributed to the understanding of the chromosphere and the phenomena that occur at the sun's surface solar prominences, those enormous arching loops of plasma that extend outward from the solar disk, visible during totality as pinkish or reddish features at the edge of the moon's silhouette. The first systematic descriptions of prominences came from eclipse observations in the 18th and 19th centuries, as astronomers began to recognize that the features were not clouds or optical effects, but actual structures of solar material extending into the corona. The physics of solar prominences, how they form, how they are supported against the sun's gravity, what causes some of them to become unstable and erupt, is another area of ongoing research. When a large prominence erupts, it can release a coronal mass ejection, a massive cloud of magnetized plasma moving outward through the solar system at speeds of several hundred to several thousand miles per second. If directed toward Earth, such ejections interact with the planet's magnetic field in ways that can disrupt satellite communications, power grids, and navigation systems. The Sun is not passive. It is active, dynamic, capable of events that reach across the solar system and affect the surface of planets. Understanding it matters in ways that are practical as well as philosophical. And much of what has been learned about it began in the borrowed darkness of an eclipse. Neuroscientists have observed that the human brain responds to the experience of learning, genuine learning, the kind that shifts a model of the world rather than simply adding a detail with a measurable release of dopamine. Not the sharp reward circuit dopamine of a pleasant surprise, but a slower, more diffuse response associated with the resolution of uncertainty. The feeling sometimes described as the satisfaction of understanding of something clicking into place. It may be that this is part of what makes the history of eclipse science so resonant even when encountered at a distance. The stories carry this quality. Eddington on his island measuring a deflection too small to see, Janssen watching a spectral line that shouldn't exist, generations of astronomers travelling to remote places setting up their instruments in the narrow paths of shadow doing, in a few borrowed minutes, what could not be done any other way, each of them in their moment of darkness learning something that changed the shape of what was known. The eclipse of 1919 changed physics. The eclipse of 1868 changed chemistry. Earlier eclipses changed navigation, changed timekeeping, changed the mathematical models of the solar system. And each of these changes propagated forward into technology, into medicine, into the infrastructure of the modern world in ways that are now invisible precisely because they have been so thoroughly incorporated. The physics of curved space-time is in your navigation device. The chemistry of helium is in the nuclear reactors that some countries use to generate electricity. The understanding of solar activity is in the systems that monitor space weather and protect satellite infrastructure. The long chain of consequence, beginning in those narrow paths of shadow, runs all the way to the present. Evidence suggests that scientific knowledge rarely arrives in isolation. It arrives embedded in specific moments, specific conditions, specific opportunities, and then it grows outward from those moments into everything that follows. An eclipse is one such moment, compressed and time-limited, offering a window that the rest of time does not. Psychologists often note that humans find meaning most readily in specific stories, not in abstractions, but in the particular. Not in the theory of relativity as an idea, but in the image of a man on a small island in the Atlantic, working through intermittent cloud with glass plates and a clock trying to measure the bend of light. The story is the way the meaning travels. The eclipse carries many such stories, each of them small and each of them part of a longer accumulation that has been building since the first person stood in a field and wrote down what they saw. Each observation adding something, each darkness offering something that the light on ordinary days keeps hidden. There is a particular quality to knowledge earned in this way, not quickly, not easily, but through patience and preparation, and the willingness to wait sometimes years for the right conditions to occur, for the path of totality to cross a patch of sky where the right stars are visible, for the cloud to part briefly in the minutes of darkness. The science of eclipses is in its way the science of patience, of knowing what to look for and being ready when the window opens. And what the scientists found across all of those eclipses, across all of those centuries of observation and measurement and careful writing down, is that the sun is not simply a light source. It is a system, a complex, dynamic, still not fully understood system, whose behavior shapes everything in its neighborhood, including the small wet planet 3 light minutes away where all of this observing has been taking place. A planet that for reasons of orbital geometry and accidental proportion is the only place in the solar system with a moon that fits exactly over the sun's face. The only place from which the corona can be seen at all with the naked eye. The only location from which all of this science was ever possible. The window, as always, was specific, and someone in each generation chose to stand in it. In the quiet that follows this long trail of observation, all those expeditions and glass plates and clay tablets and oracle bones, all that accumulated human attention directed at the same recurring darkness, there is something that settles gently and does not ask to be named. Just the knowledge that the sky has been watched carefully and faithfully for a very long time, and that the watching mattered, that it still does. And in the end, the most enduring thing the eclipse ever taught, not just to scientists, but to anyone who has stood in the path of that shadow, is something the body knows before the mind catches up. That the light returning is not the same as the light before. Something has passed through, something has been seen. And the ordinary afternoon that follows carries quietly inside it everything that the darkness briefly made visible. The day is winding down now, not just the eclipse day, but this one, the one you are in right now, wherever you are. The light outside, whatever it is doing it on its own schedule, moving through its arc, following the same physics it has always followed. And somewhere in the long patient drift towards sleep, there is one last thing the sun leaves behind each day, something softer than science and older than any record of it. After the eclipse ends, the afternoon continues. This is the part that does not make it into photographs or eclipse reports or the accounts people give to friends who were not there. The part that comes after the extraordinary, when the sky is simply sky again and the shadows fall at their ordinary angles and the world has resumed the quiet business of being itself. The birds are singing their afternoon songs now. Not the confused evening chorus they offered during totality, not the tentative dawn sequence some of them repeated when the light returned. Just the ordinary, unhurried repertoire of a mid-afternoon in whatever season and landscape this eclipse happened to cross. The bees are back on their roots. The sunflowers, if there are sunflowers, have resumed their slow tracking of the light, and the people who stood in the path of totality are driving home or sitting in fields, or standing in parking lots, still a little quiet, still in that particular state of having witnessed something they are not quite done with yet. The science of what they experience, the orbital mechanics, the atmospheric optics, the circadian chemistry, the ancient records, the bending of light by gravity, all of it is still quietly present underneath the ordinary appearance of the returning afternoon. Nothing has been undone. The knowledge has simply settled back into the background the way all knowledge does when the moment that prompted it has passed. The sun continues as it always has its fusion at the core, the conversion of hydrogen to helium, the release of energy, the long and layered journey of that energy through the radiative zone, and the convective zone and the photosphere and out into space. 4 million tons of mass becoming light every second as they have been for 4.5 billion years. Researchers who study stellar evolution describe the Sun as being approximately halfway through its main sequence lifetime. 4.5 billion years in 4.5 billion years remaining, give or take. The numbers are not precise to the year, but the broad shape of the Sun's future is reasonably well understood. For the next several billion years, it will continue burning hydrogen in its core, maintaining a luminosity close to what it has now, brightening very gradually over time as the accumulation of helium in the core slowly changes the dynamics of the fusion process. In roughly 1 billion years, this gradual brightening will have increased the Sun's output enough to make Earth's surface significantly warmer. In perhaps 5 billion years, the Sun will exhaust the hydrogen in its core and begin to expand, growing into what astronomers call a red giant, a star so large that its outer layers may extend to approximately the current orbit of the Earth. And then, after a relatively brief period of dramatic change, it will shed those outer layers in a slowly expanding cloud of gas and dust, leaving behind a dense hot remnant called a white dwarf, roughly the size of Earth, but with a mass similar to the Sun's current mass. That white dwarf will cool very slowly over billions of years until it becomes a cold, dark object drifting in whatever remains of the solar system. The end is a long way off. It is not something to hold with any urgency. It is simply part of what the Sun is, a process with the beginning, a middle, and an eventual end, the way all processes have. What we understand so far suggests that the Sun's gradual brightening over geological time has already shaped the Earth's history in ways that are still being studied. The early Earth, under a Sun that was roughly 70% as luminous as it is today, should have been frozen solid, and yet the geological record shows liquid water and signs of life stretching back more than 3.5 billion years. Scientists call this the faint young sun paradox, and the explanations proposed involve higher concentrations of greenhouse gases in the early atmosphere, different continental configurations and feedback mechanisms in the carbon cycle that are still not fully understood. The Sun and the Earth have been in a relationship for 4.5 billion years, and they have changed each other. The Sun's radiation drives the weather, the ocean circulation, the photosynthesis that produces the oxygen in every breath. The Earth's reflectivity, its atmospheric composition, its distance from the Sun, all of these feed back into the amount of solar energy absorbed and retained. It is not a one-way relationship. It never has been. The eclipse, in its own small way, is a reminder of this. For a few minutes, the Sun's light was interrupted, and everything that depended on that light, the air temperature, the biological rhythms, the behavior of insects and birds and the chemistry of human nervous systems responded. Not catastrophically, not permanently, but measurably and consistently, and in ways that revealed just how thoroughly the life of this planet is organized around one particular star. Evidence suggests that the dependence goes deeper than energy. The Sun's magnetic field interacts with Earth's magnetic field. The solar wind shapes the magnetosphere that protects the surface from harmful radiation. The ultraviolet radiation that the atmosphere filters out in the upper layers is also the radiation that drove certain mutations in the history of life on Earth, contributing to the diversity of living forms. The Sun is not simply a light source for a planet that happens to be nearby. It is woven into the chemistry and history and ongoing functioning of everything alive on the surface. The eclipse reveals this by removing it briefly, and the removal, even partial and temporary, produces a world that feels wrong in ways that go beyond the merely visual. The light, when it returns, is the same light it was before, but it feels for those who are present like something received rather than assumed. Psychologists often note that experiences of awe, The particular emotional state produced by encounters with things vast, complex, or beyond ordinary categories have measurable effects on how people perceive themselves in relation to the world around them. Studies indicate that awe tends to produce a decrease in what researchers call the perceived centrality of the self, a temporary softening of the sense that one's own concerns and activities are the most important things happening. The world briefly feels larger than the self, and this, rather than being distressing, tends to be experienced as relief. A total solar eclipse produces awe reliably, not for everyone, not identically, but consistently and across cultures. The survey data from eclipse events bears this out. People describe feeling small and part of something large simultaneously, feeling a kind of quiet gratitude with no particular object, feeling connected to the other people in the field with them, to something they have difficulty naming, to the planet they are standing on and the sky above it. The brain tends to interpret experiences of scale as meaningful, not in the sense of containing a lesson, but in the sense of mattering, of being part of something real. The shadow of the eclipse continues eastward after totality. It crosses the landscape at roughly 1,700 miles per hour, faster than most aircraft following the geometry of the moon's shadow cast at an angle across the curved surface of the Earth. In minutes, what was experienced as a profound stationary moment of darkness is already many miles away, racing toward the next town, the next coastline, the next sea. The totality that one observer stands in for 2 minutes is, from the moon's perspective, a shadow moving continuously. The stillness is an illusion of scale. The shadow never stops. Researchers who model the paths of solar eclipses use the same gravitational mechanics that Newton formalized in the 17th century and Einstein refined in the 20th. The calculations extend forward and backward in time, with equal ease past eclipses, reconstructed future eclipses predicted the paths mapped with a precision that would have astonished the Babylonian astronomers who first identified the Saros cycle from patient observation alone. The universe, it seems, is willing to be known, slowly, partially in installments, but willing. After every eclipse, the sky returns to what it was. The same blue, the same shadows, the same afternoon light that falls on the same streets and fields and faces as it always has. The ordinary reasserts itself with a completeness that is in its own way remarkable, and the people who are there carry something forward. Not a lesson, not a conclusion, something quieter than that. Something more like a recalibration, a slight adjustment to the reference point against which the ordinary is measured. A small shift in what counts as remarkable. The sun from this point forward is the same sun it always was. It will rise and set as it has always risen and set. The light will come through the window in the morning the way it always comes. Nothing has changed. And yet something has changed in the way it is received, in the quality of attention it is given, for a little while at least. For as long as the recalibration holds before the familiar reasserts its full weight, and the ordinary becomes ordinary again. This is where the science becomes quiet. Not because it runs out, there is always more. More to know about the corona, about the oscillations of the sun's magnetic field, about the precise mechanisms by which the solar wind interacts with the magnetosphere, about the long future of this star and the planet that orbits it. The questions do not end, but the quality of attention needed to receive what comes next is different from the quality needed to ask question, quieter, less directed, more receptive, the kind of attention that arrives sometimes in the minutes before sleep. When the day has been long enough and full enough and interesting enough that the mind begins to release its grip on what it was holding. When the details begin to soften at their edges. When one thought leads to another, and then to something that is not quite a thought, more like a feeling, more like a colour, more like the sense of a room getting slowly dim. The sun rose this morning. 8 minutes before you felt it, the light left the surface of the star and travelled across 93 million miles of space. It entered the atmosphere at the top of the sky. It scattered through nitrogen and oxygen, filling the air with blue. It fell on fields and rooftops and the surfaces of water, and some of it came through the window of wherever you were when the morning found you. You did not ask for it. You did not arrange for it. You simply opened your eyes and it was there, the same light that has been arriving every morning for 4.5 billion years. The same light that warmed the first organisms that floated in the early ocean. The same light that the Babylonian astronomers watched disappear and return. The same light that bent very slightly near the sun's edge, revealing the curvature of space-time to a scientist standing on a small island with an imperfect camera. The same light, arriving this morning for you. And somewhere on the other side of the planet right now, the sky is beginning to lighten. Not here. Here it is dark and still and the kind of quiet that belongs to the hours when the world has decided to rest. The temperature has dropped, the sounds have thinned, the weight of the day has eased. The sun is below the horizon, continuing the arc it always continues. The moon is somewhere overhead, following its orbit, 3.8 centimetres farther from the Earth than it was a year ago, 114 centimetres farther than it was 30 years ago. Still large enough, still the right size, the stars are there, all 5,000 of them, present above the brightness of the sky, waiting at the threshold of visibility, patient as they have always been patient. And the body here in this room is doing what bodies do when the light is gone, and the day has settled, and the chemistry of rest has been given the space to do its slow and necessary work. The breath is slower now, the thoughts are looser, the space between them is wider. Something is putting things down, gently, one at a time, the day, the light, the questions, all of it returning to the dark from which it came, which is not an ending, only the other half of the same turning. The sun somewhere below the line of the horizon, still burning, still sending the light already on its way.